The wind carried the sharp tang of diesel and damp earth as I pulled into the precinct parking lot, my boots crunching on the gravel. It was early October in Mill Creek, Ohio, and the air had that crisp edge that made you feel alive, even if you were bone-tired from a double shift. I was 32, a detective with 8 years on the force, living in a small house on the edge of town I'd bought after my divorce. My ex, Sarah, had taken our dog and moved to Cincinnati, leaving me with a mortgage and a quiet that felt heavier than it should. The job was my anchor, paperwork, interviews, the occasional burglary to solve. But lately, it was starting to fray at the edges. I'd grown up in Mill Creek, knew its rhythms like the back of my hand. The town was small, maybe 5,000 people, with a main street of faded storefronts and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since I was a kid. My partner, Lena, was younger, 27, sharp as a tack but green, still learning to trust her gut over protocol. We'd been paired up for a year, and I liked her. She didn't fill silences with chatter, and she noticed things others missed. That week, we were working a string of petty thefts, nothing serious, just enough to keep us busy. But it was the call about the missing person that changed everything. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, 64, hadn't been seen in 3 days. Her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Ed, called it in, said she hadn't picked up her mail or walked her terrier, Rusty, which wasn't like her. Clara was a widow, lived alone in a tidy bungalow on Maple Street, the kind of place with lace curtains and a front yard full of marigolds. I knew her vaguely. She'd bring cookies to the station at Christmas, always asked after my mom, who'd been her friend before Mom passed. Lena and I drove out that morning, the sky gray and heavy, like it was holding its breath. Clara's house looked normal from the outside, the grass clipped, the porch swept clean. The front door was locked, no signs of a break-in. Ed met us out front, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, his face creased with worry. He said he'd knocked yesterday, got no answer, and noticed Rusty barking inside, which wasn't usual. Clara never left the dog alone for long. I jimmied the back door, a trick I'd learned from years of dealing with old locks, and we stepped inside, calling Clara's name. The house smelled of lavender and stale coffee, the kind of scent that lingers in a place where someone's lived alone for years. Rusty was in the kitchen, his water bowl empty, his food untouched. He whimpered when he saw us, tail wagging but eyes nervous. We searched the house top to bottom. Clara's bed was made, her dishes washed, her purse still on the counter with her keys and wallet inside. Nothing looked disturbed. No overturned furniture, no blood, no signs of a struggle. But something felt off, like the air was too still, the way it gets when you walk into a room someone just left. Lena noticed it too, her brow furrowing as she scanned the living room. She pointed out a photo frame on the mantel, one of those silver ones with a picture of Clara and her late husband, turned slightly, like someone had picked it up and set it down wrong. It wasn't much, but it stuck with me. We talked to Ed again, and he mentioned Clara had been acting strange the last week, quieter, checking her windows more often, like she was expecting someone. He thought maybe she was just lonely, but he'd seen her standing in her backyard at night, staring at the alley that ran behind the houses. I made a note to check the alley, and we let Rusty out, fed him, and locked up. Back at the station, we pulled Clara's phone records and found nothing unusual, just calls to her sister in Toledo and the local pharmacy. No criminal record, no debts, no enemies, just a woman who'd vanished. That night, I couldn't sleep. The quiet in my house felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me. I kept thinking about Clara, about that photo frame, about the alley. Around midnight, I grabbed my jacket and drove to Maple Street, telling myself I was just following a hunch. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for a garbage truck, lined with sagging fences and overgrown shrubs. I parked at one end and walked it, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The air smelled of wet leaves and something sharper, like metal or rust. Halfway down, I found a spot where the gravel was scuffed, like someone had been pacing or dragging something. No footprints, no tire marks, just a patch of disturbed ground that made my skin prickle. I stood there, listening, the town asleep around me. A faint sound came from the far end of the alley, a soft thud, like a door closing. I moved toward it, my hand near my holster, my heart picking up speed. The sound didn't come again, but I felt it. That same sense from Clara's house, like I wasn't alone. I checked the backyards along the alley, shining my light over fences, but found nothing. No one hiding, no signs of Clara. Just that scuffed gravel and the echo of that thud in my head. The next day, Lena and I went back to the neighborhood, knocking on doors. Most folks hadn't seen Clara in days, but a guy 2 houses down, a mechanic named Tom, said he'd noticed a car idling in the alley a few nights back. No plates visible, just a dark sedan that drove off when he stepped outside. He couldn't say if it was connected, but it was enough to make us dig deeper. We put out a bulletin for Clara, checked local hospitals, and started pulling traffic cam footage from nearby streets. Nothing turned up. No car matching Tom's description, no sign of Clara. Days turned into a week, and the case started to weigh on me. I'd drive by Maple Street on my way home, slow down at the alley, my eyes scanning the shadows. Lena noticed I was off, asked if I was okay, but I brushed it off, said it was just the job. She didn't push, but I could tell she was watching me closer, like she knew something was eating at me. One night, I went back to the alley alone. No flashlight this time, just standing in the dark, listening. The thud came again, fainter, like it was coming from under the ground. I froze, my breath shallow, telling myself it was a pipe or a sewer grate settling. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like something, or someone, wanted me to hear it. I started checking the alley every night, telling myself I was being thorough. But it was more than that. I couldn't stop thinking about Clara, about what might have happened in that alley, about why she'd been staring into it. I pulled her phone records again, went through her sister's statements, even checked the pharmacy logs. Nothing. But the more I looked, the more I noticed small things. Neighbors saying they'd heard odd noises, not just Clara's thumping but faint hums, like an engine idling, or footsteps that stopped when they got too close. None of it was solid, just whispers of something wrong. Lena and I searched the alley together one afternoon, the sky spitting rain. We found nothing new, just that same scuffed patch of gravel, now muddy and harder to read. She asked if I thought Clara had wandered off, maybe gotten confused, but I didn't buy it. Clara was sharp, not the type to get lost. I mentioned the thud, the one I'd heard at night, and Lena gave me a look. Not skeptical, but careful, like she was trying to gauge how far I was taking this. She suggested we set up a camera, one of those motion-activated ones, to catch anything moving in the alley. I agreed, but part of me didn't want to know what it might show. The camera went up the next day, mounted on a utility pole. For 2 nights, it caught nothing but stray by. The lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the precinct's front desk as I sorted through a stack of reports. It was just past 1 a.m. in our small Iowa town, the kind of place where the biggest crimes were bar fights or kids spray painting the water tower. I'd been a cop here for 12 years, long enough to know every street and most of the faces, but the night shift still wore me down. My boots stuck slightly to the linoleum floor, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and old paper. The rest of the station was quiet. Jim, the dispatcher, was dozing in the break room, and the other 2 officers were out patrolling the empty roads. I was alone, organizing case files to keep my mind off the ache in my shoulders and the fact that I hadn't seen my daughter, Sophie, awake in days. Sophie was 8, living with me full-time since her mom, Laura, moved to Des Moines 3 years ago for a job. I'd promised myself I'd be there for her, make up for the years Laura and I spent fighting over my long hours, but the night shift meant I was gone when she went to bed and barely awake when she left for school. I'd leave notes on the fridge, reminders to eat her breakfast, little doodles to make her smile, but it wasn't enough. I kept a photo of her on my desk, her gap-toothed grin from last summer's fair, and it grounded me when the job felt like too much. Tonight, though, the precinct felt heavier than usual, the hum of the lights louder, like a mosquito you can't swat away. I was halfway through a vandalism report when I noticed a faint glow spilling up the stairwell from the basement. We kept evidence and old case files down there, in a damp, concrete room lined with metal shelves. No one went down unless they had to. The place smelled like mildew, and the single bare bulb gave off a weak, yellowish light. I figured someone had left it on, maybe Jim during a coffee-fueled filing spree. I grabbed my flashlight, more out of habit than necessity, and headed down the narrow stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew cooler, sharper, the mildew smell stronger as I reached the bottom. The bulb hung from a cord in the center of the room, glowing dimly, swaying slightly as if someone had brushed past it. I swept my flashlight across the shelves, boxes of files, sealed evidence bags, a few rusted filing cabinets. Empty, no one around. I flicked the switch off, the bulb going dark with a soft pop. The silence was immediate, broken only by the drip of a pipe somewhere in the walls. I turned to head back up, but halfway up the stairs I heard a click, sharp and deliberate, like a light switch flipping. I stopped, my hand on the railing, and looked back. The bulb was on again, its glow casting long shadows across the concrete. My heart gave a quick thud, but I told myself it was just a faulty switch, common in a building this old. I went back down, flipped it off again, and waited, watching the bulb. It stayed dark. I climbed the stairs, the echo of my boots louder now, and got back to my desk, brushing it off as one of those quirks of the precinct, like the leaky faucet in the break room. But the next night, it happened again. I was alone, sorting through a pile of traffic citations, the fluorescent lights flickering enough to make my eyes ache. The basement glow caught my attention, faint but unmistakable, spilling up the stairwell. I sighed, figuring the wiring was shot, and went down to check. The bulb was on, swaying slightly, the room as empty as before. I turned it off, waited a moment, and headed back up. Before I reached the top, that click came again, and the light flared back on. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Old buildings, bad wiring, I repeated in my head. I went down, checked the switch. It looked fine, no loose wires, and turned it off again. This time, I stood there, flashlight in hand, watching the bulb for a full minute. It stayed off, but the air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I checked the shelves, the corners, even behind the cabinets. Nothing, just the drip of that pipe and the faint smell of damp concrete. Back at my desk, I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about Sophie, how she'd asked me last week if I ever got scared on the job. I'd laughed, told her the scariest thing was paperwork, but the truth was, I'd seen enough to know fear wasn't always rational. My dad had been a cop too, back in Cedar Rapids, and he'd warned me about letting the job get in your head. He'd retired early, burned out, and I didn't want that for me, not when Sophie needed me. I glanced at her photo, her smile a reminder to keep it together. But when I reached for my pen, it wasn't where I'd left it. It was on the other side of the desk, next to my notebook, which was open to a blank page I didn't remember flipping to. I froze, my pulse quickening. I'd been alone all night, Jim still snoring in the break room. I told myself I was just tired, misplacing things, but my gut said otherwise. The next shift I got to the precinct early, before the others arrived. The basement light was off, the stairwell dark, but I checked anyway, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Everything was in place, files, evidence, cabinets. I tested the switch, flipping it on and off a few times. It worked fine. No clicks, no flickering. I even called the town's electrician, who said he'd checked the wiring but didn't sound concerned. That night I stayed at my desk, trying to focus on reports, but my eyes kept drifting to the stairwell. Around 2 a.m., the glow appeared again, faint but steady. I didn't want to go down, but I couldn't ignore it. Sophie's school play was coming up, and I'd promised to be there, awake and present, not distracted by some stupid light. I grabbed my flashlight and descended, the stairs creaking louder than before. The bulb was on, swaying gently, though there was no draft. I turned it off, my hand lingering on the switch, and waited. Silence. Then that click, and the light snapped back on. My heart jumped, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept the room. Empty as always. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. A cold breeze on the back of my neck, like someone exhaling just behind me. I spun around, my hand brushing my sidearm, but no one was there. The air was still. The bulb steady now, its glow harsh against the concrete walls. I backed up the stairs, my boots loud, my breath uneven. At my desk, I noticed my pen was gone, replaced by a paperclip bent into a tiny, perfect circle, sitting exactly where the pen had been. I didn't sleep much after that. At home, I'd check on Sophie, her small form curled under the covers, her room filled with the soft glow of a nightlight. I'd sit in the kitchen, coffee going cold, thinking about Laura, how she'd left because I was never really there, even when I was home. I'd promised Sophie I'd do better, be the dad she deserved, but the precinct was getting to me. I started checking the basement every shift, sometimes finding the light on, sometimes not. Each time it felt like the room was waiting, the mildew smell stronger, the drip of the pipe louder. I noticed more things moving on my desk. A notepad shifted, a stapler turned sideways, always small, always deliberate. I asked Jim if he'd been messing with my stuff, but he just laughed, said he barely had energy to stay awake, let alone play pranks. One night, alone again, I was filing reports when the basement glow appeared, brighter than before. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, their buzz louder, like a swarm of insects. I went down, my flashlight steady, my heart pounding. The bulb was on, but this time it flickered in a slow, deliberate rhythm. On, off, like a signal. I stood there, frozen, the air cold and heavy, the mildew smell sharp in my nose. Then, that breeze again, colder, brushing the back of my neck, raising the hairs on my arms. I turned, expecting nothing, but my flashlight caught something. A shadow, brief and formless, darting behind a shelf. I called out, my voice sharp, identifying myself as police. But the room stayed silent, the bulb still flickering. I checked every corner, every box, my hands shaking as I moved evidence bags aside. Nothing. I turned off the bulb, the click loud in the quiet, and ran up the stairs, locking the basement door behind me, a lock we never used. Back at my desk, my notebook was open again, the paperclip gone, replaced by my pen, its tip bent slightly, like it had been pressed too hard. I didn't tell anyone, not Jim, not the captain. What would I say? That the basement was haunted by a light bulb? That someone was moving my things? I started avoiding the basement, letting Jim handle evidence runs, but I'd still see that glow some nights, spilling up the stairs like an invitation. I kept working, kept showing up for Sophie's school events, her play, her soccer games, but I was distracted, checking my desk every hour, listening for that click. At home, I'd lock the doors twice, check the windows, make sure Sophie was safe. The electrician came, said the wiring was old but fine, no explanation for the bulb. I even pulled old case files, thinking maybe a disgruntled arrestee was sneaking in, but nothing lined up. No break-ins, no suspects with a grudge. The precinct felt different now. The fluorescent lights harsher, the air thicker. I still go down to the basement when I have to, but I don't linger, and I keep my flashlight on, its beam steady. The bulb still flickers sometimes, and my desk still isn't quite right, but I don't look behind me anymore, not when I feel that breeze. The streetlights cast a weak glow through the fog as I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building in Milwaukee, the patrol car's engine ticking as it cooled. It was just past 3 a.m., and the August air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and the faint tang of garbage from the alley nearby. I'd been a patrol officer for 10 years, working the night shift in a city that could be as quiet as a small town or as chaotic as a bar brawl, depending on the hour. Tonight had been a grind: 2 traffic stops, a shoplifting call at a 24-hour convenience store, and a mountain of paperwork that left my eyes burning and my shoulders knotted. All I wanted was to crash, to sink into my bed and forget the world for a few hours. But sleep hadn't been kind to me lately. Not since the job took more than I could give. Not since it took Nate. I trudged up the stairs to my 4th-floor apartment, the hallway's fluorescent lights flickering with a faint buzz, like a dying insect trapped in a jar. My boots stuck to the worn linoleum, each step echoing in the quiet, the sound bouncing off the peeling paint on the walls. My place was a mess. Takeout boxes stacked on the counter, a pile of laundry spilling over the couch, my duty belt slung over a chair, its weight pulling the fabric taut. I didn't bother tidying up, just kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed, the mattress creaking under me like an old ship. The ceiling fan spun slowly, its hum blending with the distant drone of traffic on the street below, a low pulse that never quite stopped. I closed my eyes, hoping for a few hours of rest, but my body had other plans. It started like it always did, a heaviness, like sinking into quicksand, my limbs locked, my chest tight, my breath shallow. Paralysis del sueño, the doctor had called it, a side effect of long shifts and stress. It had been happening for months, ever since Nate, my best friend and partner of 5 years, took a bullet during a botched raid last year, his blood staining the pavement as I tried to keep him talking, his voice fading as the ambulance lights flashed in the distance. At first, the paralysis was just that, being stuck, unable to move, staring at the ceiling as my heart pounded, the room dark except for the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the blinds. I'd see vague shapes in the corners, shadows that flickered like smoke, and hear a low buzz, like a fan with a loose blade, vibrating in my skull. I'd wake up gasping, my shirt damp with sweat, telling myself it was just my brain misfiring, a trick of exhaustion. But lately, the episodes had gotten worse, more vivid, like the darkness was taking shape, growing claws. That night, as the paralysis took hold, the room felt colder, the fan's hum slowing to a deep, uneven drone, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. My eyes darted to the corner by the dresser, where a shadow pulsed, darker than the rest, not just a blur, but something solid, tall and hunched, with long, thin fingers that seemed to graze the hardwood floor. My heart slammed against my ribs, the buzz in my ears growing louder, now a faint whisper, like static trying to form words, slithering through the air. The figure moved, gliding closer, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face a smudge except for 2 glowing points. Eyes, like headlights cutting through fog, locked onto me with a weight that pinned me harder than the paralysis itself. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, my breath shallow and ragged, caught in my throat like a trapped animal. The figure stopped at the edge of my bed, its fingers twitching, curling like they were reaching for something just out of sight. The whispers sharpened, almost my name, repeated in a low, uneven chant that sent chills down my spine. A pressure settled on my chest, heavier than usual, like a cold hand pressing down, sinking into my skin, its chill spreading through my veins. Then, with a jolt, I was free, gasping, my hands clawing at the sheets, my shirt soaked through. The room was empty, the fan still spinning lazily, the street outside quiet except for a distant car alarm wailing in the night. I checked the clock, 3:42 a.m. Only minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, my reflection pale in the dim light, eyes sunken from too many sleepless nights. As I turned back to the bedroom, I noticed something. A faint scratch on the wooden bed frame, 3 thin lines, like something had scraped it with a nail or a blade. I hadn't seen it before, but the apartment was old, full of marks from past tenants, scuffs and dents that told stories I didn't know. I told myself it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I gripped the sink. The next night, I got home later, around 4 a.m., after a call about a disturbance at a bar downtown, a couple of drunks arguing over a spilled drink. My head throbbed, my body begging for rest, but I dreaded, closing my eyes, knowing what waited. I sat on the couch, the TV on low, some late-night talk show I wasn't watching, its laughter tinny and distant. When I finally dragged myself to bed, the paralysis hit almost immediately, faster than before, like it was waiting for me. The shadow was there, clearer now, its long fingers curling at its sides, its glowing eyes brighter, unblinking, burning into me. The buzz was louder, the whispers distinct, my name repeated in a slow, mocking cadence that seemed to echo inside my skull. The pressure on my chest was worse, like ice spreading through my veins, and I felt a cold breath on my face, sharp and real, like someone leaning close, their presence heavy in the dark. When I snapped out of it, my throat raw from gasping, I saw my bedroom door was ajar, though I'd locked it before bed. The bolt turned back as if by an unseen hand. I checked the apartment, flashlight in hand, my sidearm still locked in its safe in the closet. Nothing was out of place, but the air felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm, with a faint smell of ozone lingering, like after a lightning strike. I started avoiding sleep, downing coffee at the precinct, my hands jittery as I filled out reports in the break room's harsh light, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing like the whispers in my dreams. I thought about Nate, how he'd always been the one to keep me grounded, cracking jokes during stakeouts, his laugh cutting through the tension like a knife. He'd been more than a partner. Family. The kind you choose. The kind you'd take a bullet for. Losing him in that raid, watching him bleed out on the pavement while I radioed for help, his hand going limp in mine, broke something in me that hadn't healed. My sister Ellie had noticed it, calling from Chicago every week, her voice tight with worry, asking if I was eating, if I was okay. She'd begged me to see a therapist, to talk about Nate, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, couldn't put words to the hole he'd left. I hadn't told her about the paralysis, the shadows, didn't want her thinking I was cracking under the pressure of the job. But the episodes were eating at me, making me question what was real, what was just my mind unraveling. I checked the precinct's records, looking for reports of break-ins or prowlers in my neighborhood, thinking maybe someone was messing with me, a disgruntled suspect from a past arrest. There'd been a few burglaries, small-time stuff, electronics, cash, but nothing near my building, no suspects who'd target a cop's apartment. I walked the hallway outside my place, checking for signs of tampering, but the locks were solid, the windows secure, the fire escape rusted but untouched. I thought about the raid, how it had gone wrong so fast, how Nate had pushed me out of the way, taking the shot meant for me. The guilt was a weight, heavier than the paralysis, and it followed me into every corner of my life, into the dark of my apartment. The third night I tried staying awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, its bitter steam curling in the air. The TV's glow flickered across the room, some infomercial about knives that could cut through anything, its pitchman's voice grating. But exhaustion won, and I drifted off, my head slumping onto my arms, only to wake in paralysis again. The figure was closer, leaning over me, its fingers inches from my face, long and thin, twitching like they were alive on their own. The whispers were loud now, my name repeated in a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The pressure on my chest was crushing, the cold breath sharper, like ice on my skin, so close I could feel its rhythm. When I broke free, gasping, my bedside lamp was on, though I hadn't touched it, its light casting harsh shadows across the room. I checked the apartment, my flashlight beam shaking, and found a glass in the sink, tipped over, a faint smudge on its rim, like a fingerprint that wasn't mine. I hadn't used it, hadn't even been in the kitchen that night, but there it was, glinting under the fluorescent light. I called in sick the next day, a first in years, my voice hoarse over the phone as I lied about a cold. I went to the hardware store, bought new deadbolts, and installed them myself. The drill's whine cutting through the quiet of the afternoon, my hands steadying as I worked. I checked the building's security footage, but the hallway camera was old, grainy, showing nothing but shadows moving in the flicker of the lights. No clear shapes, no faces. I called the landlord, asked if anyone had access to my apartment, a maintenance guy, a former tenant, but he said no, the place was mine alone, his voice annoyed at the question. I thought about telling Ellie, but what could I say? That I was seeing things in my sleep? That my apartment felt like someone else's? That the shadows were following me even when I was awake? I started keeping my sidearm closer, still locked, but within reach, and slept with the lights on, the fan off to avoid that buzz that echoed the whispers. I went back to work, kept patrolling the streets, kept my head down, but the precinct felt different. The radio's static sharper, like it was trying to speak, like it knew my name. The paralysis kept coming, the figure closer each time, its whispers louder, its eyes burning into me, unblinking. Sometimes in the quiet of the precinct, I'd hear a faint buzz, like a voice just out of reach, and I'd check the corners, half expecting to see those long fingers reaching out from the dark. My apartment's locks are new, the windows secure, but I don't feel alone anymore. Not when the lights are off, not when I close my eyes. The July heat pressed down on Mill Creek, Ohio, heavy and unyielding, the kind that made my police uniform stick to my skin as I walked my usual route along Main Street. I was 29, 6 years into the job, living alone in a cramped apartment above the hardware store. My parents had left for Florida 2 years prior, and I was the last Becker in town, tethered to this place by routine and a stubborn sense of duty. The town was quiet, always had been, save for the occasional bar fight or kids messing around at the old grain silo. My partner, Carl, a grizzled guy in his 50s with a bad knee, was stuck on desk duty after twisting his ankle, so I was pulling solo shifts. That morning, dispatch patched through a call from Mrs. Ellison, a widow who lived out by the edge of town. She sounded rattled, said she'd been hearing noises, low, steady thumps, coming from the empty lot behind her house near the old Parker property for 3 nights straight. She mentioned seeing a shadow move across the lot once, too, though she couldn't be sure what it was. I figured it was probably animals or some drifter camping out. The Parker place, a vacant lot now after the house burned down a decade ago, was just overgrown weeds and cracked concrete, but kids still used it as a shortcut or a place to smoke. Mrs. Ellison wasn't one for dramatics, so I grabbed my flashlight and drove out. The lot sat at the end of a gravel lane, flanked by tangled sumac and a ditch that reeked of stagnant water. I parked my cruiser and walked the rest of the way, the crunch of my boots loud in the still air. The sun was high, but the lot felt dim somehow, like the light didn't quite reach the ground. Weeds choked the cracked foundation where the house once stood, and a rusted chain-link fence sagged along one side. I scanned the area, expecting to find beer cans or cigarette butts, typical signs of kids. But there was nothing. Just dirt and weeds, and a faint, earthy smell that didn't sit right, like damp soil turned over too many times. I called out, my voice carrying across the open space. "Mill Creek PD? Anyone out here?" No answer, just the hum of cicadas and the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. I moved deeper into the lot, checking the corners where the fence met the trees. That's when I noticed the ground. Parts of it looked disturbed, not like animal tracks, but like someone had been digging, then smoothed it over. It wasn't obvious, just patches where the dirt was too flat, too even, compared to the uneven clumps around it. I crouched, running my hand over one spot, and felt a slight give, like the soil wasn't packed tight. A sound stopped me, a faint thud, like a footfall, coming from the tree line at the back of the lot. I stood, hand resting near my holster, and squinted into the shadows. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavier now. The cicadas buzzed sharper. I told myself it was probably a deer or a stray dog, but my pulse was up, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching. I walked toward the trees, my boots sinking slightly in the soft dirt, and called out again. "Police, show yourself." Silence, but the kind that feels like it's hiding something. I should have called it in, but Mill Creek's a small department. Backup was Carl limping over or waiting for a deputy from the next county. I kept moving, flashlight sweeping the underbrush, and found a narrow path leading into the woods. It wasn't a trail anyone maintained, just a worn strip where the weeds were trampled. The earthy smell was stronger here, mixed with something sharp, like rust or old metal. About 20 feet in, I found a clearing, maybe 10 by 10, with a patch of dirt that looked freshly turned. No tools, no tracks, just that same too smooth surface, like someone had been here and covered their work. My radio crackled, and I nearly jumped. Dispatch had nothing new, just checking my status. I reported what I'd found, disturbed ground, possible trespassing, and asked them to pull records on the Parker lot. As I spoke, I heard another thud, closer this time, back toward the lot. I turned, moving quickly but quietly, my eyes scanning the trees. When I reached the open lot again, it was empty, but the air felt different, like the pressure before a storm. I stood there listening and caught a faint rustle from the far side of the fence, near the ditch. I moved toward it, my flashlight beam cutting through the glare, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken weeds, just that lingering smell. I drove back to the station, filed a report, and tried to shake it off. That night, lying in my apartment, the ceiling fan clicking above me, I kept replaying the lot in my head, the smooth dirt, the thud, the way the shadows seemed to shift just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, maybe kids or a homeless guy passing through, but sleep didn't come easy. The next day, I went back with Carl, who grumbled about the heat and his ankle but came along anyway. We walked the lot, and I showed him the disturbed patches. He squinted at the ground, chewed his toothpick, and said it looked like nothing, maybe rain or animals. The clearing in the woods was still there, but the dirt looked less fresh, like it had settled overnight. Carl didn't see anything worth worrying about, but I caught him glancing over his shoulder as we left. Mrs. Ellison called again a few days later, saying the thumping was back, louder now, and she'd seen that shadow again, moving near the fence. I went out alone, late in the afternoon, the sky turning bruised purple with an approaching storm. The lot was the same, empty, quiet, but that earthy smell was stronger, and the disturbed patches looked fresher, like someone had been back. I checked the clearing again, and this time there was a small pile of dirt in the center, maybe a foot high, like it had been scooped and left there. No shovel, no tracks, just the pile, neat and deliberate. I started driving by the lot on every shift, sometimes twice a night, telling myself I was just being thorough. But I'd slow down, stare into the shadows, half expecting to see something move. One night, I stopped my cruiser and got out, the air cool for once, the cicadas silent. I stood at the edge of the lot, flashlight off, just listening. That's when I heard it, a low, steady thump, like a heartbeat, coming from the direction of the clearing. I didn't go in. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the flashlight steady, and every instinct told me to get back in the car. I didn't tell Carl about that night. I didn't write it up. Mrs. Ellison stopped calling a week later, and when I checked on her, her neighbor said she'd gone to her daughter's in Columbus, couldn't stand the quiet anymore. The lot's still there, still empty, as far as anyone knows. I keep patrolling, keep doing my job, but I avoid that lane now. Take the long way around. Sometimes, on night shifts, I hear that thump again. Faint, like it's carried on the wind. I tell myself it's just my head, but I don't believe it. The radio hissed just after 11 p.m., cutting through the low hum of the patrol car's engine as I cruised through Akron's east side. My partner Eddie sat beside me, sipping coffee from his thermos, the steam curling in the dim glow of the dashboard. We'd been working the night shift together for 3 years, long enough to know each other's quirks, his bad jokes, my habit of double-checking my duty belt. The call from dispatch was routine. A woman in a low-rise apartment building reported loud noises from the unit next door, which was supposed to be empty. She sounded shaken, describing bangs and thumps like someone moving furniture. Eddie rolled his eyes, figuring it was just another overreacting neighbor, but I took it seriously. I'd grown up in Cleveland's tougher neighborhoods, where every odd sound could mean trouble, and 5 years on the force hadn't dulled that instinct. We pulled up to Maple Grove Apartments, a tired brick building with a neon sign flickering out front. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of cigarette smoke and wet asphalt from an earlier rain. My flashlight beam caught the cracked sidewalk as we walked to the lobby, the linoleum sticky under my boots. The caller, Mrs. Larson, met us on the 3rd floor, her door cracked open, her face pale under a messy bun. She said the noises came from 3B, the vacant unit next to hers. The landlord had told her it had been empty for months, no tenants since the last guy moved out. The banging started around 10 p.m., she said, heavy and deliberate, like someone dragging something across the floor. She hadn't seen anyone, didn't want to check herself, and I could see the worry in her tight grip on her sweater. We knocked on 3B's door, the sound sharp in the quiet hallway. Nothing. Eddie tried the handle. Locked. I pressed my ear to the door, expecting to hear something, but it was silent, just the faint hum of pipes in the walls. We called the landlord, a gruff guy named Tom who showed up 15 minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The apartment was bare, no furniture, no curtains, just scuffed hardwood and a stale smell, like dust and old paint. My flashlight swept the rooms, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, all empty. No signs of a break-in, no marks on the doorframe, no footprints in the thin dust. Eddie checked the windows, all locked tight. I asked Mrs. Larson if she'd heard anything else, like voices or footsteps, but she shook her head, looking almost embarrassed. We told her to call if it happened again, and she nodded, closing her door with a soft click. Back in the car, Eddie chuckled, saying it was probably the building's old bones creaking. I wasn't convinced. My dad, a mechanic who'd worked late shifts, always told me to trust my gut when something felt wrong, and 3B felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off, like the air was too still. I thought about my sister, Jenna, back in Cleveland, who'd always worried about me being a cop. She'd call after every big case, asking if I was okay, if the job was worth it. I hadn't talked to her in weeks, too caught up in patrols and paperwork. Maybe that's why I was on edge. Too many late nights, too little sleep. We moved on to other calls, a drunk guy yelling downtown, a lost dog report. But I kept thinking about that empty apartment, the way it seemed to watch us. The next night, the call came again. Same time, same story. Mrs. Larson sounded more anxious, saying the noises were louder, more insistent, like someone was pounding on the walls. Eddie was off, picking up a day shift for a buddy, so I went alone. I didn't love solo calls, but I'd done them before, mostly noise complaints or minor disputes. I parked under the same flickering streetlight, the neon sign buzzing faintly. The lobby smelled of mildew now, the air heavier than the night before. I took the stairs to the 3rd floor, my boots echoing in the empty stairwell. Mrs. Larson was waiting, her door ajar, her eyes darting to 3B. She said the banging started at 10 again, but this time she swore she heard a low hum, like someone muttering under their breath. She hadn't looked out, didn't want to know, and I couldn't blame her. I knocked on 3B's door, my flashlight beam steady on the faded paint. No answer. The handle was locked, same as before. The landlord wasn't picking up, probably asleep, so I radioed dispatch to keep trying. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. At first nothing, just the building's low hum, then a single thump, sharp and heavy, like a chair hitting the floor. My heart jumped, and I stepped back, my hand brushing my sidearm. I called out, identifying myself as police, but got no response. The hallway was silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I told Mrs. Larson to stay inside, lock her door, and she nodded, her face pale as she shut herself in. I had a skeleton key for basic locks, standard for wellness checks, so I decided to use it. The lock clicked open, the door creaking as it swung inward, releasing a puff of stale air. The apartment looked identical to last night, empty, dim, the hardwood reflecting my flashlight's beam. I checked the kitchen, bare counters, closed cabinets. The bedroom, empty, no closet doors to hide behind. The bathroom, just a chipped sink and a shower with a stained curtain. No signs of anyone, no scuff marks, no dust disturbed. But the air felt thick, like it was pressing against my skin, and my flashlight beam seemed weaker, the shadows deeper. I stood in the living room listening, but the thump didn't come again. Just silence, heavy and wrong. Then I heard it, a soft scrape, like a shoe dragging across wood, coming from the bedroom I'd just checked. My pulse spiked, and I turned, flashlight raised, my other hand hovering over my sidearm. The bedroom was still empty, but the sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the floor. I called out again, my voice sharp, but got nothing. I moved toward the bedroom, my boots loud against the hardwood, and swept the light across the walls. The scrape stopped, replaced by a faint tap, like a knuckle against glass. It came from the window, but when I checked, it was locked, the glass clean. No one outside. The street below was empty, just the streetlights flicker and the glint of wet asphalt. I backed out, locking the door behind me. My radio crackled, dispatch saying the landlord was unavailable but they'd keep trying. I told Mrs. Larson I found nothing, to call if it happened again, but she looked unconvinced, her eyes fixed on 3B's door. Back in the patrol car, I sat for a moment, the engine idling, my hands gripping the wheel. I thought about my dad's advice, about trusting my instincts, but I had nothing to go on, just a sound, a feeling, and an empty apartment. I thought about Jenna, how she'd laugh if I told her I got spooked by a noise complaint. She'd always been the brave one, the one who'd sneak out at night as a kid, daring me to follow. I hadn't called her in too long, and the thought of her worrying made my chest tight. The next day, I checked the building's records at the station. Unit 3B had been vacant for 4 months, the last tenant leaving after a job transfer. No criminal reports, no break-ins, nothing unusual. I called Mrs. Larson to follow up, but she said the noises stopped after that night, like a switch had been flipped. She sounded relieved, but there was an edge to her voice, like she didn't quite believe it was over. I asked Eddie about it when he got back, but he just shrugged, saying old apartments make all kinds of noises, especially in the fall when the temperature shifts. He was probably right, but I couldn't shake the memory of that scrape, the tap on the glass. I thought about my ex-girlfriend Lisa, who'd moved out last year because she hated how the job made me jumpy, always checking the locks, always on edge. Maybe she had a point, but I'd been a cop too long to ignore my gut. I went back to my routine, patrols, paperwork, the usual grind. Mrs. Larson didn't call again, and I didn't push it. But when I drive by Maple Grove now, I glance at the 3rd floor, at the dark windows of 3B. I tell myself it was nothing, just an old building settling, maybe a squatter who moved on. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll hear a faint tap, like a knuckle on glass, and I'll check the windows, just to be sure. They're always locked, the street outside empty, but I keep my flashlight close and I don't linger in the dark too long. The pine needles crunched under my boots as I stepped out of my truck, the cool Oregon air sharp with the scent of damp earth and resin. I'd moved to this cabana just outside Bend a month ago, after 25 years as a detective in a small coastal town called Newport. Retirement was supposed to be my escape, a way to leave behind the weight of cases that clung like damp clothes after a storm. But sleep was a stranger now. Insomnia had me trapped. My nights spent pacing the creaky floorboards of the cabana, the silence broken only by the wind rattling the windows or the distant howl of a coyote. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Lily, a 9-year-old girl from a 2008 case, found dead in an alley behind a diner, her small body tucked under a tarp, eyes wide open, hair tangled with leaves and dirt. We never found her killer, never even got a solid lead. That failure followed me like a shadow, heavier now in the quiet of retirement, a constant reminder of the one case I couldn't close. The cabin was small, just a bedroom with a sagging mattress, a living area with a worn couch and a wood stove, and a kitchen that looked out over a dense pine forest. I'd bought it cheap, hoping the solitude would help me reset, maybe give me a chance to rebuild the bridge to my daughter Claire, who lived in Portland. She hadn't spoken to me much since her teens, blaming me for missing her birthdays, her high school graduation, all because I was chasing cases like Lily's. I'd call her sometimes, leave voicemails she rarely answered, promising to visit, to be the father she deserved. But the job had carved out too much of me, left me with nothing but memories, and a desk cluttered with old case files I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Lily's file was there, its edges worn from years of handling, photos and reports I'd pore over at night, searching for something, anything I'd missed. The diner's neon sign, the tarp's frayed edge, Lily's missing shoe. Every detail was burned into my mind, as vivid now as it was 17 years ago. One night, around 3 a.m., I was on the couch, the TV flickering with an old western, the volume low to keep my mind from wandering back to Newport. A soft tap came from the bedroom window, like a twig brushing the glass in the wind. I ignored it at first, figuring it was the forest, always alive with small sounds, branches snapping, animals scurrying. But it came again, sharper, deliberate, like a finger tapping once, then stopping. My heart gave a quick thud, an old instinct from the job kicking in. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy mag light from my detective days, and stepped outside, the cold biting my hands, the air thick with the scent of pine and frost. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the grass, the pines swaying gently in the breeze. I swept the beam over the yard, the forest's edge, but found nothing. No branches, no animals, just the faint rustle of leaves. The window was clean, no marks, no smudges, its frame weathered but intact. Back inside, I locked the door, the bolts click loud in the quiet, and told myself it was nothing, just the cabana settling into the night. But my pulse stayed high, my hands unsteady as I set the flashlight down. The next night, it happened again. I was in bed, staring at the wooden beams above, my eyes heavy but refusing to close, the insomnio a weight as heavy as the guilt over Lily. The tap came, clearer this time, from the same bedroom window, a single sharp note against the glass. I sat up, my breath catching, and peered through the blinds, the slats cold under my fingers. At the edge of the forest, maybe 40 feet away, stood a small shadow, motionless under the moonlight. It was child-sized, its outlines soft but distinct, like a silhouette cut from black paper, its head tilted slightly as if watching. My stomach twisted, Lily's face flashing in my mind, her wide eyes, her tangled hair, the way she'd looked in that alley. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, my boots sinking into the damp earth, the air sharp with the smell of wet pine. The shadow was gone, the forest empty. No tracks in the soft ground, no broken twigs. I stood there, my beam sweeping the trees, my pulse loud in my ears, the cold seeping through my jacket. Back inside, I noticed my desk drawer was slightly ajar, a pen I kept there now lying on the floor, its cap off, the ink tip glinting in the lamplight. I stopped trying to sleep after that. I'd stay up, coffee pot brewing, the TV's hum a weak shield against the silence of the cabana. I checked the locks, the windows, even the attic hatch. Everything was secure, no signs of anyone breaking in. I called the local sheriff's office, asked about prowlers or kids wandering the area, but they had nothing, just a few reports of lost hikers from weeks ago, none near my property. I thought about Claire, how she'd scoff if I told her I was jumping at shadows, how she'd always said I lived in the past, stuck on cases that didn't matter anymore. But Lily's case wasn't just a case. It was the one that broke me, the one that made me question every choice I'd made as a cop, as a father. Back in Newport, I'd interviewed everyone. Diner staff, neighbors, a drifter passing through, even the girls' teachers. Every lead fizzled, every witness saw nothing, and the guilt still gnawed at me, sharper now in the quiet of the cabana, where there was nothing to distract me from it. The taps kept coming, always around 3 a.m., sometimes at the bedroom window, sometimes the kitchen, each one a little louder, a little more deliberate. Each time I'd check, flashlight in hand, my heart pounding, and see that shadow at the forest's edge. Closer now, its shape clearer. A small figure, head tilted, arms limp at its sides. I started checking the perimeter twice a night, my boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth, the flashlight's beam cutting through the dark. One night, I stayed outside longer, sitting on the porch with the light off. The moon's glow enough to see by, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp moss. The tap came, sharp and quick, from the living room window. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs, and caught a glimpse of something. A small hand, pale and delicate, pressed against the glass for a moment before vanishing. I rushed to the window, my beam shaking, but there was no print, no mark, just the reflection of my own tired face, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. My stomach twisted, my mind screaming it was Lily, though I knew that was impossible. She'd been gone for 17 years. I started keeping my old service revolver closer, locked in its case by the bed, though I hadn't touched it since retiring. I went through Lily's file again, spreading the papers across my desk. Crime scene photos, witness statements, a sketch of the alley behind the diner with its flickering neon sign. I'd memorized every detail, the tarp's frayed edge, the scuff marks on the pavement, Lily's missing shoe, but nothing new jumped out. Yet things kept moving in the cabana. A coffee mug in the sink I didn't use, a chair shifted slightly from the table, a book on the shelf turned upside down. I told myself it was the insomnio, the guilt playing tricks, but my gut, honed by years on the force, said otherwise. I'd been a detective too long to believe in coincidences, too long to ignore the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the light. I thought about my old partner Tom, who'd worked the case with me. He'd retired a few years before me, moved to Arizona, said the job had taken too much out of him. We'd stayed up late some nights, drinking cheap whiskey, trying to make sense of Lily's case, but we never got anywhere. He'd told me to let it go, said it'd eat me alive if I didn't, and I'd nodded, but I couldn't. Now, in the cabana, it felt like the case was finding me, creeping into the quiet spaces of my new life. I started avoiding the windows at night, keeping the blinds drawn, but the taps persisted, each one a reminder of that alley, of Lily's face. I checked the forest during the day, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, looking for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the ground was always clean, the pines silent except for the wind. One night I set up my phone to record the backyard, propping it on the kitchen counter, hoping to catch something solid, something I could show the sheriff if it came to that. The tap came as usual, sharp against the bedroom window, and I checked outside, my boots sinking into the damp earth, finding nothing but the usual empty forest. When I played the footage back, it showed only darkness, the pines swaying under the moon's glow, no shadow, no hand. But as I watched, I heard a faint sound on the recording, a soft tap, like the one I'd heard, but slower, almost deliberate, followed by a low rustle, like footsteps in leaves. I played it again, my hands cold, and noticed a brief flicker in the corner of the frame, like a small shape moving just out of sight. I froze, my heart loud in my chest, and checked the window again, running my fingers over the glass, cold and smooth, no marks, no prints. I stopped going outside after that, kept the blinds drawn, the TV on to fill the silence, its glow casting shadows that made me jump. I thought about calling Claire, telling her I was sorry for all the years I chose the job over her, for missing the moments that mattered. But how do you explain that you're seeing a dead girl's shadow, that your cabana doesn't feel like yours anymore? I'd left her another voicemail that week, promising to visit, but she hadn't called back, and I didn't push. The sheriff's office offered to do a drive-by, but I waved them off, not wanting to sound like the old cop who'd lost his grip. I pulled Lily's file out less often, trying to distance myself, but her face was still there. Every time I closed my eyes, her eyes wide, her hair tangled. The taps haven't stopped, and neither has the shadow, always at the forest's edge, always just out of reach. I don't look out the windows anymore, not when I hear that tap. But I keep the flashlight on the nightstand, the revolver close, and I don't turn off the lights. The flickering glow of my laptop screen was a familiar companion in the quiet hours of the night. As a freelance journalist, chasing down leads often meant venturing into less conventional corners of the internet. Tonight, my curiosity, spurred by hushed rumors on obscure forums, had led me to the dark web, a labyrinth of hidden sites promising anonymity and sometimes illicit thrills. I was investigating whispers of illegal live transmissions, the kind of disturbing content that could be a huge story if proven real. My apartment, usually a haven of focused work, felt strangely still, the air thick with anticipation. I'd set up my virtual private network, ensuring my digital footprint was masked, and navigated through layers of encrypted sites. The interface was stark, minimalist, a stark contrast to the glossy, ad-laden surface web. After some digging, I found a link, deceptively simple, labeled stream07.move. My fingers, guided by that journalistic imperative, clicked. The screen loaded, displaying a live feed. It was a room. Not a high-tech studio or a bustling office, but a small, desolate space with dirty, peeling walls. The lighting was dim, a single bare bulb casting harsh shadows. In the center, a chair lay toppled on its side. It looked like a basement, or perhaps a neglected storage room. The air in my own apartment suddenly felt heavy, chilled, despite the comfortable temperature. I was acutely aware of the building's faint creaks, the distant hum of traffic on the city streets outside. A thin, almost metallic smell, like old damp concrete, seemed to emanate from the screen. My professional detachment kicked in. I started analyzing the feed. Grainy resolution, but clearly live. The camera was mounted high in a corner, providing a wide, unsettling view. As I watched, the camera began to move. Slowly. A smooth, almost imperceptible pan, as if controlled by an unseen operator. It swept across the stained concrete floor, lingering on various imperfections. Then I saw them. Dark stains on the floor. Irregular shapes, deep and unsettling against the pale concrete. They looked recent. The kind of stains that spoke of spilled liquid, perhaps something viscous, something that had dried and darkened over time. My stomach churned. This wasn't just an abandoned room. It felt like a crime scene. The camera continued its slow, silent traverse of the room. It passed a workbench littered with rusted tools, a collection of empty, grimy jars. The only sound in my room was the soft whir of my laptop's fan and the frantic thumping of my own heart. And then, it happened. A shadow flickered across the screen. It was fast, a fleeting blur of darkness that cut across the lower corner of the frame, near the overturned chair, too quick to fully register. But it was there, a distinct, almost human-shaped void in the dim light. And then it was gone. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands, clammy with sweat, froze on the keyboard. I immediately replayed the last few seconds of the feed. Frame by frame. Slow motion. There it was. A fleeting, indistinct darkness. Like someone had just walked quickly out of frame, but there was no one visible in the room. The chair remained toppled. The stains remained undisturbed. Nothing. Only the shadow. My rational mind, trained to dissect evidence and seek logical conclusions, screamed at me. A glitch. A dust mote catching the light. A trick of the low resolution. But the primal part of my brain, the one that screamed danger, was already taking over. My skin crawled. The air in my apartment felt impossibly cold. Despite my attempts at logic, a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I took a shaky breath, the air feeling thin and metallic. My gaze remained fixed on the screen, on that desolate room, the faint trace of that fleeting shadow. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the nature of the content I was seeking. But the certainty that I had seen something that shouldn't have been there, gnawed at me. Then, a new, far more unsettling realization struck me. My eyes swept across the details of the room on the screen. The low ceiling, just barely clearing the top of the camera's view. The rough, unfinished concrete floor. The way the pipes ran along the ceiling, exposed and grimy. The single bare light bulb. The small, elevated window near the ceiling, just a sliver of darkness showing beyond. A profound, chilling wave of recognition washed over me. The room on the screen. It looked exactly like my own basement. Not just similar, almost identical. The same configuration of pipes, the same low ceiling, the same kind of rough, stained concrete. The exact placement of the single exposed light bulb. Even the way the window was positioned, high up, barely visible from the camera's angle. My own basement was old, unfinished. A place I rarely ventured into, used mostly for storage. But its image, its very structure, was seared into my mind. My blood ran cold. My entire body stiffened, every muscle locked. My breath caught in my throat. The logical impossibility of it, the horrifying coincidence, was too much to bear. This wasn't some random abandoned room. This wasn't just a chilling feed from a forgotten place. This felt personal, disturbingly, terrifyingly personal. Every rational thought abandoned me. I didn't care about the story anymore. I didn't care about illegal transmissions or journalistic scoops. All I wanted was to disconnect, to erase it, to unsee what I had seen. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my laptop shut, the sudden darkness plunging my apartment into near-total blackness. The click of the lid echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I ripped the Ethernet cable from the wall, severing the connection, then fumbled with the power button, shutting down my desktop tower with a desperate urgency. The comforting hum died. The faint blue light vanished. My apartment was now completely dark, the only illumination the faint glow of distant city lights filtering through my living room window. I stumbled out of my chair, my legs wobbly beneath me. My mind was screaming, a chaotic mix of fear and disbelief. That room, that shadow, that chilling resemblance. It was burned into my mind, an indelible image. I found myself staring at the floorboards of my apartment. Just below them, Directly beneath my feet was my basement. That dark, cold, neglected space. The space that looked exactly like the room on the screen. The space where that shadowy figure had flickered. A wave of nausea washed over me. Could it be that this wasn't just a random feed? That someone was, somehow, broadcasting from my own house? The thought was absurd, impossible. Yet the undeniable visual evidence screamed otherwise. I backed away from the floor, stumbling until I hit the wall. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees up to my chest, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. The darkness of my apartment felt immense, suffocating. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, seemed to speak of unseen presences, of things lurking just beyond sight. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the frantic drumming of my heart and the imagined whisper of unseen eyes. I swore I could feel a cold draft rising from the floorboards. The night stretched on, an eternity of waiting. Every nerve ending was on fire. I didn't dare turn on the light, preferring the dimness, the comforting blanket of shadows, to the stark illumination that might reveal something I wasn't ready to see. I listened, straining my ears for any sound, any movement from below. A muffled scrape, a faint whisper. But there was nothing. Only the suffocating quiet and the frantic drumming of my own heart. I even pulled my blanket up to my chin, as if its thin fabric could somehow protect me from a purely visual threat. I found myself staring at the floor, imagining the concrete walls, the overturned chair, the dark stains. Was it still down there? That shadowy thing? Was it still flickering in the dim light? Or had it moved? Was it slowly, silently, making its way up the basement stairs, towards me? The very thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms into them, trying to erase the image, but it was useless. It was etched there, behind my eyelids, a constant chilling reminder. The smell of dust and damp earth, usually absent in my clean apartment, seemed to fill my nostrils. I could almost feel the rough texture of the dirty walls against my skin, hear the faint drip of water. I didn't sleep a wink. I just sat there, huddled on the floor, my eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the invisible boundary between my living space and the dark void below. The profound, chilling certainty that I was being watched, that something had infiltrated my home, would not let me go. Every shadow in my room seemed to deepen, to coalesce into impossible shapes, almost reaching out to me. My apartment, my sanctuary, suddenly felt utterly permeable, exposed. The first faint streaks of gray appeared in the eastern sky, signaling the reluctant arrival of dawn. The light, weak at first, gradually strengthened, pushing back the shadows, revealing the familiar contours of my room. The oppressive feeling began to recede, slowly, reluctantly. My apartment felt less like a trap, more like a familiar space. But the terror didn't vanish entirely. It settled deep in my bones, a cold, hard knot, a permanent scar on my psyche. I never reinstalled that browser. I scrubbed my system, reinstalled my OS, did everything I could to erase any trace of that night. But the image of that room, the overturned chair, the dark stains, and that fleeting shadow continued to haunt me. And now, I avoid the basement. I found every excuse imaginable to stay away from those creaky wooden steps, from that heavy, uninviting door. Weeks have passed and I haven't been down there. Every time I walk past the basement door, I find myself listening for any sound, any movement, and wondering, with a chilling certainty, if it's still down there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to open the door and step into its domain, or worse, if it has already found its way out. The chill that settled over me that autumn wasn't just the change in the weather. It was something insidious, something that had burrowed deep, rattling around in the quiet moments. It started, as most self-inflicted wounds do, with an itch, an insatiable curiosity. I was a second-year computer science student, and a cybersecurity project had me delving into the internet's murky underbelly, the so-called dark web. My initial forays were academic, clinical even, but then the rabbit hole deepened. I'd always been the logical one, the person who sought out explanations, who thrived on data and quantifiable facts. This, whatever this was, defied all my established frameworks. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of my carefully constructed reality. I remember the hum of my laptop, the faint glow of the screen illuminating my face in the otherwise darkened room. It was late, past midnight, and the only sounds were the distant city murmur and the rhythmic tap of my fingers on the keyboard. I'd stumbled upon forums, hidden marketplaces, all the digital detritus you read about but rarely encounter firsthand. The sheer volume of illicit information was overwhelming, a testament to humanity's darker impulses. And then, there it was, an unassumingly titled link, just a string of characters in a sea of them, promising a live stream. My cynical programmer's mind assumed it was some kind of elaborate phishing scam, or perhaps just an empty page. Still, a morbid fascination tugged at me, a desire to see what depravity might lie beyond the veil of anonymity. I clicked. The stream buffered for a moment, then flickered to life. The image that resolved on my screen was disorienting. It was clearly the interior of a house, but not one I recognized. The perspective was low, as if the camera was resting on the floor or a very short tripod. The room was a mess, truly a chaotic disaster. Furniture, a couch, a couple of armchairs, was overturned, cushions askew, like a child's tantrum writ large. Stains, dark and viscous, marred the faded wallpaper, a sickly yellow that only amplified the grime. It wasn't just messy, it felt violated. The air of neglect was palpable, even through a screen. The silence of the stream was heavy, punctuated only by a faint, almost imperceptible static, like the distant hum of a forgotten appliance. No people, no movement, just this tableau of domestic decay, frozen in time. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen slightly. My initial thought was squatter's den, or perhaps an abandoned house being used for some unsavory purpose. The lighting was poor, a single weak bulb somewhere out of frame casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the static on the screen. As I watched, the camera began to move. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with a deliberate, dragging sort of motion. It wasn't a quick pan. It was more like a slow, agonizing crawl across the room, as if being dragged by an unseen force. My heart began to thud against my ribs, a nervous rhythm that grew louder with each incremental shift of the perspective. This wasn't a prank, not a loop. This was live. The raw, unfiltered reality of it sent a shiver down my spine. The camera continued its agonizingly slow traverse until it reached a corner of the room, an area shrouded in the deepest shadows. And there, almost swallowed by the gloom, was a figure. It was utterly still, a silhouette against the slightly lighter wall, its form indistinct. My initial reaction was a jolt of fear, followed by a rational attempt to dismiss it. A coat on a hanger? A pile of clothes? My mind raced through every conceivable logical explanation, but the shape was too human, too upright, too purposefully positioned. It defied the randomness of discarded objects. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the zoom function on the player. The image pixelated as I magnified it, but the figure grew larger, clearer in its terrifying ambiguity. It was still, so incredibly still, like a forgotten statue, a sentinel of decay. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no discernible limbs, just a dark, columnar shape in the oppressive shadows. And then, as if sensing my scrutiny, as if it knew I was there, watching from miles away, the figure seemed to subtly shift. It wasn't a sudden jolt, not a dramatic turn. It was a slow, almost imperceptible rotation, a languid pivot towards the camera's lens. My blood ran cold, a glacial flow through my veins. My mind screamed at me that it was a trick of the light, a distortion of the low resolution, a product of my sleep-deprived imagination. But a primal, guttural part of me knew otherwise. It was turning. It was looking. Even without a face, without eyes that I could see, I felt the weight of its gaze, a direct, unfiltered stare that pierced through the screen, through the miles, through the fabric of my own safe reality. It was an intrusion, a violation of the digital distance. A gasp caught in my throat, a dry, choked sound. My hand shot out, slapping the laptop lid shut with a desperate, clumsy force. The screen went black, plunging my room back into near-total darkness, but the image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The dark, unmoving shape in the corner, its slow, inexorable turn, the profound, unseeing gaze. It was a phantom limb of my consciousness, an indelible mark. I didn't open my laptop again for days. Not for that project, not for anything. The cybersecurity project was abandoned, a minor casualty in the face of a much larger, more terrifying dread. My professors were understanding, attributing my sudden disengagement to burnout. They couldn't have known the truth, the kind of truth that would brand you as unhinged, that would earn you pitying glances and hushed conversations. How could I articulate a fear that stemmed from a nameless, faceless presence glimpsed through a digital window? The image wouldn't leave me. It lingered, a phantom presence in the periphery of my vision. I'd be walking across campus, the sun bright on my face, and suddenly, I'd see it. The figure, turning, watching. I'd be in the library, surrounded by the comforting rustle of pages, and the memory of that oppressive silence, the faint static, would crawl into my ears, chilling me to the bone. My friends noticed my quietness, my increased jumpiness. "Clara, you okay?" They'd ask, their faces etched with concern. I'd offer vague excuses about stress, about the demands of the computer science program. How could I explain that I'd stared into an abyss and it had stared back? That the world, once so predictable, now felt subtly off-kilter? Sleep became a battlefield. I'd drift off, only to be yanked awake by a sudden, irrational certainty that it was in my room, standing in the corner, just out of sight. My eyes would dart to the deepest shadows, expecting to see that form materialize. I started leaving a light on, a small nightlight casting a weak glow. But even then, the shadows played tricks on my eyes, morphing into that familiar, terrifying silhouette. I'd lie there, rigid with fear, my heart hammering, until the first rays of dawn offered a fragile reprieve, a temporary banishment of the dread. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in logic and algorithms, tried to dissect it, to find a scientific explanation. A deep fake? A pre-recorded video designed to elicit a reaction? A sophisticated piece of psychological manipulation? But the sheer, unblinking stillness of the figure, the unsettlingly slow movement, the profound sense of being observed, it defied easy categorization. It felt too real, too raw, too deeply personal to be mere trickery. It was an experience that had burrowed into my very core. I started to check the locks on my apartment door multiple times before bed, a habit I'd never had before. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I found myself scanning crowds, my eyes darting, searching for an unfamiliar face, a figure that seemed out of place, a shadow that lingered a moment too long. Paranoia, I knew, was a dangerous game, but it felt less like a game and more like a deeply ingrained survival instinct. a constant state of hypervigilance. My world had shrunk to the confines of my fear. One evening, I was cooking dinner, the comforting sizzle of oil in the pan the only sound in my small kitchen. I was chopping vegetables, my mind drifting, when I caught a flicker in the reflection of the darkened window above my sink. Just for a second. A dark shape, indistinct, in the yard outside. My hand froze, the knife poised midair. I strained my eyes, pressing my face close to the glass, but there was nothing. Only the familiar shapes of the trees, the faint glow of the streetlights. My breath hitched, a cold knot forming in my throat. It was just a shadow, a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination, wasn't it? My mind wrestled with itself, desperately clinging to logic. I forced myself to turn back to the cutting board, but my hands were shaking, and the image of that turning figure, faceless and terrifying, superimposed itself over the vibrant colors of the vegetables. I felt the cold sweat prickling on my skin, the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The comforting familiarity of my home had been irrevocably tainted. The silence in my apartment, once a source of comfort, became a vast, echoing chamber for my anxieties. Every gust of wind rattling the windows sounded like a hand fumbling at the latch. Every distant siren seemed to be growing closer, its wail a prelude to something unspeakable, a grim fanfare announcing an inevitable confrontation. I knew, intellectually, that the dark web was a dangerous place. I knew the risks of venturing into its hidden corners. But nothing, no textbook, no cybersecurity lecture, could have prepared me for the visceral terror of that moment, of feeling that invisible connection, that silent acknowledgement from something utterly alien and profoundly malevolent. It was a breach of reality, a tear in the fabric of the ordinary. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside was quiet and the world seemed to hold its breath, I'd find myself staring at my closed laptop, a strange, terrible urge to open it again, to find that link, to see if it was still there, to see if it was still watching, to confirm, perhaps, that it wasn't just a figment of my tormented mind. But the fear, the cold, gripping terror, always won out. I couldn't. I simply couldn't. The memory of that turning, unseeing gaze was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the world was asleep, I still felt it, that silent, unsettling presence, just beyond the edge of perception, always there, always watching. The silence now holds a different meaning, a sinister undertone that I can never quite shake. The blinking cursor mocked me. Another article on digital subcultures, another deep dive into the obscure corners of the internet. It was my beat at the newspaper, a niche I'd carved out for myself, exploring the fringes where society's anxieties and obsessions manifested online. This time, my editor had suggested I look into the more clandestine aspects, the dark web. I'd always approached these assignments with a detached, journalistic curiosity, a sense of intellectual adventure. That detachment, I would soon discover, was a luxury I could no longer afford. My apartment, usually a haven of quiet productivity, felt different that night. The hum of my old desktop computer, typically a comforting drone, seemed amplified, a low thrum against the stillness. Outside, the usual city symphony of distant sirens and occasional car horns was muted, as if the world beyond my windows held its breath. I was deep into my research, navigating layers of encrypted networks, when I stumbled upon it, a link simply labeled Live Feed. No description, no context, just those two stark words. My journalistic instincts, honed by years of chasing leads, kicked in. This was exactly the kind of unvarnished, unfiltered content I was seeking. I clicked. The screen flickered, then resolved into an image of a long, dark corridor. It was unsettlingly mundane at first glance. cracked, peeling paint on the walls, a dingy linoleum floor. But the lighting was what truly unnerved me. It wasn't just dim. It was a series of flickering fluorescent tubes, casting stark, dancing shadows that stretched and contracted with each pulse of light. The effect was nauseating, making the already desolate space feel almost alive, twitching in the gloom. The air of neglect was palpable, even through the screen. The camera, positioned low, began to move slowly forward. It wasn't a smooth, professional tracking shot. It was jerky, almost hesitant, as if the person holding it was struggling, or perhaps simply walking with immense caution. I watched, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, utterly transfixed. The corridor seemed endless. Door after closed door slid past, each one identical, anonymous, their dull surfaces reflecting the erratic light. They looked like standard office doors, the kind you find in any old, sprawling administrative building. No numbers, no names, just a series of identical thresholds leading to unknown spaces. The silence of the stream was profound, heavy. No footsteps, no distant chatter, just the visual pulse of the flickering lights. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a vacuum that invited my own anxieties to fill it. My heart began to beat a little faster, a low throb in my ears that threatened to drown out the faint whir of my computer fan. This wasn't some pre-recorded loop, I instinctively knew. The subtle variations in the flicker, the slight, almost imperceptible shifts in perspective, screamed live to me. After what felt like an eternity, the camera's agonizingly slow progress halted. It stopped directly in front of one of the anonymous doors. My breath caught in my throat. This was it, I thought. The payoff. Something was about to happen. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes straining to pierce the grainy gloom, my body rigid with anticipation. The flickering light intensified, throwing the door into stark relief. And then, I saw it. It wasn't a person walking past, not a clear figure. It was a blur, a shadow that moved with impossible speed behind the frosted glass panel on the door. It was gone in an instant, a fleeting disruption in the static gloom, but it was undeniably there. A dark, formless mass that darted from one side of the panel to the other, too fast to properly register, too distinct to be merely a trick of the light. My stomach churned. It felt like watching something inhuman, something that didn't obey the laws of physics as I understood them. And then, the second, more chilling realization washed over me. A wave of cold dread that froze me in place. The cracked walls, the flickering lights, the dingy linoleum floor, the generic office doors, it all looked sickeningly familiar. It looked exactly like the fourth-floor corridor of the newspaper building where I worked. The same aged infrastructure, the same neglect in areas that weren't public-facing. My mind raced, trying to find a flaw in the resemblance, a distinguishing feature. But there was none. The chilling familiarity was absolute. My hand shot out, not even thinking, and I slammed my laptop shut. The sudden darkness was a relief, a desperate attempt to sever the connection, to unsee what I had seen. The quiet of my apartment, once soothing, was now menacing. Every creak of the old floorboards, every settling groan of the building seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. I didn't open my computer again that night, nor the next day, nor for many days after. The article on digital subcultures remained unfinished, a damning testament to my shattered composure. My editor called concerned, but I mumbled excuses about creative blocks, about hitting a wall. How could I explain that I'd seen a digital ghost, a phantom reflection of my workplace, and it had fundamentally altered my sense of safety? Sleep became a fractured, anxious affair. Every shadow in my room seemed to deepen, to coalesce into indistinct shapes in the periphery of my vision. I found myself lying awake for hours, straining my ears, listening to the innocuous sounds of my apartment building. A neighbor moving furniture, the distant rumble of the elevator, the drip of a faulty faucet. Each sound was scrutinized, analyzed, distorted by my fear. Was that the gentle creak of my door opening? Was that a faint scuttling sound from the hallway just outside my apartment? My imagination, usually a tool for crafting vivid prose, had turned against me, painting terrifying scenarios behind every mundane noise. I started checking the lock on my front door obsessively. A single turn wasn't enough. I'd try it, then retry it, sometimes 3 or 4 times, pushing against the wood to ensure it was truly secure. Even then, the feeling of vulnerability persisted. The image of that shadowy blur, darting behind the glass panel, was burned into my mind. It was an impossible speed, a movement that spoke of something alien, something that didn't belong. And the fact that it was in a place so intimately familiar, so mundane, made it all the more terrifying. It broke the rules of reality, and that breach had fractured my own sense of security. Work became an ordeal. Walking down the corridors of the newspaper building, especially the dim, less trafficked ones, sent shivers down my spine. The flickering fluorescent lights, once merely an annoyance, now felt like a spotlight on my fear, illuminating every crack in the walls, every dent in the doors. I avoided the 4th floor whenever possible, taking circuitous routes, making excuses to colleagues. When I absolutely had to go there, my eyes darted nervously, scrutinizing every shadow, every closed door. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting, just beyond one of those anonymous panels. My colleagues noticed my change, the subtle shift from my usual engaged self to a more withdrawn, jumpy version. They attributed it to the stress of the job, the late nights, the pressure of deadlines. They were kind, offering coffee, asking if I needed help. I just offered a strained smile, a vague nod. How could I explain that the very ground beneath my feet, the place where I spent most of my waking hours, now felt like a stage for an unseen horror? The line between the digital world and my physical reality had blurred, irrevocably. The horror wasn't confined to a screen. It had seeped into my life, infecting my perceptions. I'd stand in my kitchen, making a late-night snack, and the faint reflections in the window would momentarily morph into the familiar flicker of those corridor lights. My own home, once my sanctuary, now felt like a fragile barrier against an encroaching dread. The rational part of my brain, the journalist, desperately sought answers. Was it a prank? A highly elaborate setup by some twisted individual or group? But the sheer cold terror I felt, the inexplicable familiarity of the corridor, defied simple explanation. It felt too personal, too precise to be random. I still work at the newspaper. I still write about digital subcultures, though my passion for it has dulled, replaced by a cautious trepidation. I try to avoid the dark web, but the memory, the haunting image of that flickering corridor and the impossible shadow is always there, lurking in the recesses of my mind. And every night, before I turn out the lights, I listen. I listen to every creak, every groan, every whisper of the wind outside. And I can't help but wonder, with a cold knot in my stomach, what, if anything, might be waiting just on the other side of my door. The silence in my apartment is never truly silent anymore. The hum of the desktop tower was usually a comforting drone in my room, a familiar companion during late-night gaming sessions or frantic study sprints. But tonight, it felt different, amplified by the heavy silence that had fallen over the house. My parents were away for the weekend, visiting my grandparents, leaving me in the expansive quiet of our suburban home. It was the kind of freedom most teenagers craved, but tonight, it felt less like liberty and more like a vast, echoing emptiness. My curiosity, a trait I usually considered a strength, had led me down a path I now deeply regretted. I was exploring, not the usual corners of the internet, but the deeper, more shadowed layers, the dark web. I'd set up my secure network, followed all the cautionary guides, convinced myself I was being smart, untouchable. Just looking, I'd promised myself. just satisfying a morbid curiosity about the world beyond the filtered, sanitized surface. The screen glowed with the stark, anonymous interfaces of onion sites, a stark contrast to the colorful vibrancy of the regular web. The air in my room, usually filled with the scent of old books and stale pizza, seemed to carry a faint metallic tang, like old electronics. I'd stumbled upon a forum dedicated to urban exploration, a niche community fascinated by abandoned places, hospitals, asylums, old schools, derelict factories. I scrolled through blurry photos, a mix of genuine architectural decay and unsettling graffiti. It was fascinating, a glimpse into forgotten histories. Then, a link caught my eye. A compressed file, labeled only as collections. My fingers, guided by that insatiable curiosity, clicked to download it. The file transferred quickly, a small, insidious package arriving on my desktop. I double-clicked, and a folder popped open, filled with hundreds of images. Most were standard fare: crumbling brick, shattered windows, peeling paint. But as I scrolled, a specific series of photos began to emerge. They depicted a single long, dark hallway. It looked like a hospital, or maybe an old sanatorium. Fluorescent lights hung precariously from the ceiling, some flickering, some dead. On either side, heavy, identical doors, each with a faded, numbered plaque. The air in these photos seemed thick with dust and neglect, almost palpable. The photos progressed, moving slowly down the length of the corridor. Each image was taken from slightly closer, a meticulous, unsettling journey deeper into the unknown. The perspective never changed, as if the photographer was walking a straight, unswerving path. The details of the hallway became clearer: a smear on the wall, a loose tile on the floor, the peeling paint around the door frames. The silence of my room felt heavier, pressing in as I focused on these digital breadcrumbs. And then I saw it. In the last photo of the series, at the very end of the hallway, in the deepest part of the shadows, almost swallowed by the gloom emanating from what looked like an open door, there was a figure. It was blurry, indistinct, shrouded in shadow, almost like a smudge on the old lens. But it was undeniably there. And its posture, it was facing me. Or rather, facing the camera. It seemed to be looking directly out of the photo, directly at me. The eyes, though indistinct, seemed to bore into mine, even through the screen. A cold shock, sharp and immediate, jolted through me. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of my room. My blood ran cold, a sudden icy rush. It wasn't just a blurred shape. There was a sense of depth, of eyes, of an almost human form emerging from the darkness. My hand, trembling violently, hovered over the mouse. My rational mind, the one that usually dissected complex code and logical arguments, screamed at me. It's just a smudge, a trick of light, an illusion. But the primal part of my brain, the one that screamed danger, was already taking over. The hair on my arms stood on end. My stomach clenched, a sickening knot. I clicked the delete button hard. The file vanished, sent to the digital abyss of the recycle bin. Then, with a frantic urgency, I clicked again, confirming the permanent deletion. Gone. Vanished. As if it had never existed. My fingers were slick with sweat. My next move was almost instinctive. I slammed the laptop lid shut, plunging my room into semi-darkness. The sudden absence of the screen's glow left a ghost image burned onto my retinas, that dark hallway, that looming figure. The hum of the computer, now just a low vibration beneath the desk, seemed to mock me. I sat there, hunched in my chair, listening. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer just quiet, but a vast, expectant presence. Every creak of the old house, every distant hum from the street outside, seemed amplified, imbued with a new, sinister meaning. My ears strained, trying to distinguish familiar sounds from the terrifying possibility that something had breached the boundary between the digital and the real. The scent of old dust, usually unnoticed, now seemed sharp, acrid. My eyes darted to my bedroom door. It was closed, a thin line of light from the hallway seeping beneath it. Beyond that door lay the hallway of my house. Our hallway. A familiar space, usually comforting. Now the thought of it sent a fresh wave of dread through me. I couldn't stop looking at it. The closed door, the strip of light beneath it. My imagination, usually a tool for creative writing assignments and fantasy games, was now my tormentor. It conjured images, whispered possibilities. What if that figure, that blurry, shadowed shape from the photograph, was no longer confined to the digital realm? What if it had found a way out? I stood up, slowly, my muscles stiff, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I needed to check, to confirm, to prove to myself that this was just a trick of my mind, a result of too much screen time and an overactive imagination. I walked to the door, my steps slow, deliberate. Each one felt heavy, weighted with unspoken dread. My hand, clammy with sweat, reached for the doorknob. It was cold. I turned it, the soft click echoing loudly in the stillness. I pulled the door open, just a crack at first. The hallway stretched before me, illuminated by the dim nightlight my mom insisted on keeping on. Our hallway, the familiar coat rack, the framed family photos, the small table with the decorative bowl. All mundane, all normal. But as my eyes scanned the familiar space, a profound sense of being watched washed over me, chilling me to the bone. It was an oppressive weight, a gaze that felt almost physical, pressing on the back of my neck. It wasn't the kind of observation from a security camera, a dispassionate lens. This was personal. This was sentient. It felt like something was standing just beyond my line of sight, in the shadows at the end of my hallway, observing my terror, enjoying my discomfort. My entire body prickled with an unshakable certainty. I was not alone. Every rational thought abandoned me. I didn't care about the dark web anymore. I didn't care about my curiosity. All I wanted was to feel safe. I slammed the door shut, the resounding thud echoing through the quiet house. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. I backed away from the door, stumbling backward until I hit my bed. I sank onto the mattress, pulling my knees up to my chest, my eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on that closed door. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The night stretched on, an eternity of waiting. Every nerve ending was on fire. I didn't dare turn on the light, preferring the dimness, the comforting blanket of shadows, to the stark illumination that might reveal something I wasn't ready to see. I listened, straining my ears for any sound, any movement from beyond the door. A creak of the floorboards, a whisper, a shuffle. But there was nothing, only the suffocating quiet and the frantic drumming of my own heart. I even pulled my blanket up to my chin, as if its thin fabric could somehow protect me. I found myself staring at the closed door, imagining the numbered doors of the abandoned hospital superimposed over my own. Was it this door, or the one at the end of the hall leading to the bathroom? The figure. It had been at the end of the hall. My hall ended at the bathroom. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it was burned into my mind. I didn't sleep a wink. I just sat there, huddled on my bed, my eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the narrow strip of light beneath my bedroom door and the dark, familiar hallway beyond. The profound, chilling certainty that I was being watched, that something had followed me back from that digital abyss, would not let me go. Every shadow in my room seemed to deepen, to coalesce into impossible shapes, almost reaching out to me. The very air felt heavy, laden with an unseen presence. The first faint streaks of gray appeared in the eastern sky, signaling the reluctant arrival of dawn. The light, weak at first, gradually strengthened, pushing back the shadows, revealing the familiar contours of my room. The oppressive feeling began to recede, slowly, reluctantly. The house felt less like a trap, more like a familiar space. But the terror didn't vanish entirely. It settled deep in my bones, a cold, hard knot. I never opened that laptop again, not for anything. The deleted file remained deleted, a non-existent threat in the digital realm. But the memory of that night, and the chilling certainty that I had not been alone, would forever linger. And now, every time I walk down the hallway of my own home, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, always looking towards the darker corners, always expecting to see it. That blurry figure, waiting, watching, stepping out of the shadows. The blue light of my monitor was the only illumination in my apartment, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. As a systems technician, I spent my days, and often my nights, navigating the intricate pathways of networks, debugging code, and patching vulnerabilities. My apartment, a small space in a quiet building, was usually a place of comfortable solitude. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, heavy and expectant, almost as if it were listening. My curiosity, a professional hazard more than a personal flaw, had led me down a rabbit hole I should have avoided. I'd been delving into the deeper, less traveled corners of the internet, testing a secure connection, always with the self-justification of understanding new threats. This time I'd found a particularly intriguing link on a hidden forum, a promise of live access to public security cameras. Not the usual street cams or traffic monitors, but something more private. Something that felt illicit, even to me. I clicked the link. After a moment of buffering, a new window popped up, displaying a grainy, low-light feed. It was an office. Empty, or so it seemed. Desks were cluttered with half-finished papers, stray coffee mugs, and dormant monitors. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows dance. It looked like any generic corporate office, abandoned for the night. The stillness was profound, broken only by the faint whir of my computer's fan. The air in my room felt strangely colder, despite the warmth of my laptop on my lap. I was acutely aware of the building's faint creaks, the distant hum of traffic on the city streets outside. My technical brain immediately started analyzing the feed. Frame rate, resolution, IP address. It was a genuine live stream, not a loop. I leaned closer to the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Interesting. I clicked through a few more camera options, seeing different angles of the same deserted space. A break room, a server closet, another section of cubicles. All empty, all eerily still. The silence of my own apartment suddenly felt too deep, too profound. I returned to the first feed, the wide shot of the main office floor. My eyes, accustomed to scanning lines of code for anomalies, now scanned the mundane details of the deserted office. A half-eaten granola bar on a desk, a chair slightly askew, the faint reflection of a street lamp in a far window. Then I saw it. A chair, at a cubicle near the back, facing away from the camera. It shifted, just a fraction of an inch. A slow, almost imperceptible scrape against the carpet, as if someone had just pushed it back from the desk. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart, which had been beating with the steady rhythm of detached observation, gave a sudden hard lurch against my ribs. Disbelief warred with a creeping sense of unease. I immediately replayed the last few seconds of the feed, frame by frame. No one. The cubicle was empty. The entire office was empty, yet the chair had moved. My rational mind, the one that debugged complex systems and identified logical flaws, immediately sought explanations. A building settling? A draft? A glitch in the camera feed? A dropped frame creating the illusion of movement? But the shift had been too fluid, too natural for a simple pixel artifact. It looked like someone had been sitting there and just stood up. The cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Despite the logical arguments, a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. The air in my apartment felt heavy, thick. My hands, trembling slightly, reached for my own coffee mug, its ceramic cool against my clammy palm. I took a slow, deliberate sip, trying to ground myself. The coffee tasted like ash. My gaze kept drifting from the screen to the dark corners of my own room. I watched the screen, my gaze fixed on that chair. It remained still, unmoving. The fluorescent lights above it continued their weary flicker. The silence of the empty office on my screen felt profound, echoing the unnerving quiet of my own apartment. I scrolled to another camera feed, a different part of the office. This one showed a long conference room, its polished table reflecting the dim overhead lights. A large window occupied most of the far wall, looking out onto a dark, indistinct cityscape. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the urban glow. As my eyes adjusted to the new angle, I saw it. In the reflection on the window, a figure. It was indistinct, a deeper shadow against the already dark reflection of the room, almost transparent. But it was there, standing perfectly still. Its outline was humanoid, vaguely tall, slender, and it was facing the window, which meant it was facing the camera, which meant it was facing me. The eyes, though indistinct, seemed to bore into mine, even through the grainy feed. It was a silent stare, an unblinking gaze from within the confines of the deserted office. My blood ran cold. My entire body stiffened, every muscle locked. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a trick of light. This was a presence, an unmoving, silent observer, and it was there, in the empty office, looking out. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a gasp. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me. The camera feed showed an empty room. The chair had moved. And now this reflection. It defied all logic, all the rules of reality I knew. Every rational thought abandoned me. I didn't care about the dark web anymore. I didn't care about security vulnerabilities or network protocols. All I wanted was for it to be gone, to unsee what I had seen. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my laptop shut, the sudden darkness plunging my apartment into near total blackness. The click of the lid echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I fumbled for the power button on the desktop tower, pressing it down hard. The comforting hum of the fan died. The faint blue light vanished. The apartment was now completely dark. The only light, the faint glow of the city filtering through my own window. I stumbled out of my chair, my legs wobbly beneath me. My mind was screaming, a chaotic mix of fear and disbelief. That reflection, that still, dark figure. It was burned into my mind, an indelible image. I found myself staring at my own apartment window. The glass, reflecting my own pale, terrified face, showed only the familiar cityscape beyond. But in the periphery of my vision, I kept seeing it. A deeper shadow, a still figure, just beyond my own reflection. Was it there? Or was my mind simply projecting the horror I had just witnessed? The faint scent of ozone, like after a storm, lingered in the air. I backed away from the window, stumbling until I hit the wall. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees up to my chest, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. The darkness of my apartment felt immense, suffocating. Every creak of the building, every distant siren seemed to speak of unseen presences, of things lurking just beyond sight. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the frantic drumming of my heart and the imagined whisper of unseen eyes. The night stretched on, an eternity of waiting. Every nerve ending was on fire. I didn't dare turn on the light, preferring the dimness, the comforting blanket of shadows, to the stark illumination that might reveal something I wasn't ready to see. I listened, straining my ears for any sound, any movement, a whisper, a shuffle, but there was nothing. Only the suffocating quiet and the frantic drumming of my own heart. I even pulled my blanket up to my chin, as if its thin fabric could somehow protect me from a purely visual threat. I found myself staring at the closed door to my bedroom, then to the unlit hallway beyond. My apartment, usually a haven of routine and predictability, suddenly felt different, unfamiliar. Every shadow in my room seemed to deepen, to coalesce into impossible shapes, almost reaching out to me. The very air felt heavy, laden with an unseen presence. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my palms into them, trying to erase the image, but it was useless. It was etched there, behind my eyelids, a constant, chilling reminder. I didn't sleep a wink. I just sat there, huddled on the floor, my eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the dark, reflective surface of my unlit monitor. The profound, chilling certainty that I was being watched, that something had followed me back from that digital abyss, would not let me go. My home, my sanctuary, suddenly felt utterly permeable, exposed. The first faint streaks of gray appeared in the eastern sky, signaling the reluctant arrival of dawn. The light, weak at first, gradually strengthened, pushing back the shadows, revealing the familiar contours of my room. The oppressive feeling began to recede, slowly, reluctantly. My apartment felt less like a trap, more like a familiar space. But the terror didn't vanish entirely. It settled deep in my bones, a cold, hard knot, a permanent scar on my psyche. I never reinstalled that browser. I scrubbed my system, reinstalled my OS, did everything I could to erase any trace of that night. But the image of that reflection, the still, silent figure in the empty office, continued to haunt me. And now, every time I look into a dark window, every time I catch my own reflection in the glass, I find myself looking for it, that deeper shadow, that unmoving figure, just beyond my own image, watching, waiting. And I'm left to wonder, with a chilling certainty, if I was truly alone in my apartment that night, or if something had somehow crossed the digital divide and slipped into my world.